I'll just start by saying welcome everybody to our session today. This session is about accessing funding to deliver essential digital skills. So without further ado, I will pass you over to our guest speaker, Bij Kazmarcic, who is an FE consultant and is going to speak. Well, I'll let him introduce himself.
Thanks very much, then. Good. I'm just going to move it on to the first slide, just to, if people can tell me where it's moved on. Yeah, it's okay? Yeah.
Yeah, it's moving on all right.
Brilliant. Because on occasions, what I've done is I've sort of started moving slides, and about 20 minutes into the presentation, people have said to me, you're still on the first slide, but hopefully that's not happening. Well, first of all, thanks very much for welcoming me, inviting me to talk this morning about how you can fund the essential digital skills qualifications and other things that you might be doing in terms of provision for adults. And I'm going to be focusing on the adult education budget. The focus is going to be on the education of adults in England. Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland have got their separate arrangements, although they're using very similar methodologies. A little bit about myself. I'm semi-retired. I'm chair of governors at a medium-sized FE college. I'm also chairman of the board of the largest independent learning provider of beauty therapy and complementary therapies in Britain, and also past experience of working in local authorities, provision, adult community learning in colleges and in schools, as well as in the independent sector. And I've also worked with third sector organisations. I've worked with the WEA, and I'm at the moment working with Westminster Adult Education Service. So I've got a fairly extensive background in funding, planning, and in the, if you want, how to advise providers of all shapes and sizes, of all different types of provision to adults, in how best to optimise the funding they can get for their provision, as well as to ensure that they meet the requirements of audit, as well as the expectations of Ofsted or any other quality assurance organisations you might be working with. As Laura said at the very beginning, if there's at any point you want to ask a question, either use the chat facility or the Q&A, and if I don't see it myself, then I'm sure that Laura or Aniela will direct me to it, and I'll do my best to answer it. If you want to wait to the end, we can do so, or once we go off record, then obviously you can do that once the recording stops. So what we're going to be looking at in the next 50 or so minutes. Well, what are the different ways in which adult learning is being funded in England? I'll be looking at the education budget. And by the way, if at any point I use a 3-letter or 2-letter or 4-letter acronym, please, and you haven't met it before, just make sure you stop me and make sure you ask through the Q&A or the chat. I'll be looking at, I won't be mentioning any more than looking at some things like loans and other sources of funding, because across England, if you look over the last 5, 10, 15 years, there've been a range of initiatives, some coming from the community and local authority background sector, some coming through health in terms of health promotion, some coming across community development, etc. And of course now with COVID, we've got a series of different initiatives which are trying to get adult learners back into learning, particularly those that have been made unemployed, those who've been on furlough, or those who are disadvantaged most by what's happened over COVID. So I'll mention those briefly. We're looking at the adult education budget because that's the main means by which the essential digital skills qualification will be funded in England. And so they will look at the main elements of it. I know some of you are already drawing down adult education budget funding in your own right. Several of you will be actually subcontracting to a bigger provider which has got an adult education budget contract or allocation. So I'll look at the main elements of that and then put that in the context of how national entitlements, and of course the essential digital skills qualification is now part of the national entitlements in England for adults. You can obviously offer the essential digital skills qualification to younger people, that's age 16 to 18, but that isn't part of the adult education budget. That's the 16 to 18 funding methodology and funding allocation, which goes to colleges, schools, local authorities and other providers. I'll pick up some of the issues about local flexibilities, the low wage flexibilities, and of course, one area that is often ignored by policymakers, but is absolutely critical for adults who are the furthest away from learning, most disadvantaged, to find a way into learning. That's non-regulated learning. In other words, running programs which are not externally regulated or not part of the regulated qualifications framework. And we'll see then how the essential digital skills qualifications are funded and what disciplines lie around the funding of them. If you're a provider thinking about offering the essential digital skills qualification, then you've got to realize that there are the funding is attached to the learner and the individual qualification or learning aim that they do. So if an adult does more than one qualification at the same time or in sequence, for example, essential digital skills plus a functional skill or an ESOL program or employability skills, each one of those are separately funded and have their own disciplines under the adult education budget. And then if there are any other questions, we'll pick those up as we go through, if not during the program, at the very end of the program. So hopefully that's going to meet your needs. And as I said, the start point sometimes is to say, give you some idea of the scale. Well, in England, the adult education budget, which comes from the Education and Skills Funding Agency, which is the main, if you want, branch of government that is responsible for funding learning. It used to be a separate, used to separate between young people and adults, but now it's the one agency that looks after young people and adults. And what that will do is it will give you some idea of how much is actually around, what do you call it, the level of funding. The indicative level was about £1.5 billion. And that was in the spending plans for 2019-20. Of course, now it's a bit more complicated because we've also got other funds which are being used to help adults, particularly as part of the COVID recovery. But it was about £1.5 billion. When you think about that, at its peak, that was meeting the needs of about 3 million adults in England. So you can see that the average investment in a course or a qual was about £50 to £60, and it doesn't sound like a lot. Now, there have been underspends on adult education budget, and they've been recorded and reported extensively in the press. And sometimes you think, well, why haven't the providers used all that funding if we know there's a demand for learners? Well, what's worrying is that that level of funding has not changed for years. And, you know that inflation is there. You know that as providers, as centres, you need to make sure that you've got enough to cover your running costs. Even if you're predominantly using volunteers, what about the staff that have to be on contract or given more permanent roles? Then it's sad to see that that didn't change in real terms. And as a result, if you go back to 2011-12, when it was roughly the same level, there are now 1 million fewer adults in learning. And that is including English and maths, which are seen as key skills that adults should be offered to be able to function effectively in society, to go to work or to undertake further training and learning. What's happened in the last few years, about half of that total amount of AEB is now not run from the Education and Skills Funding Agency. In other words, it's not coming nationally in England. It's being devolved to 7 combined authorities. That will grow next year with the introduction and the inclusion of Sheffield City Region. So think about the combined authorities like Greater Manchester, Liverpool, West Midlands, Tees Valley, etc. And it's been delegated to Greater London. So if any centres are here from London, you'll be familiar with the fact that you also have a relationship, if you're already funded, whether directly or through a subcontract, with the Greater London Authority. And the other thing to note is that in many cases, particularly working with the furthest away from learning, the most disadvantaged communities, there are still significant volumes of subcontracting. So in other words, A prime, which is usually the main provider, gets a contract or an allocation from the ESFA or from a combined authority if it's devolved, and then does not deliver all of the training. It subcontracts some of that training, some of the delivery of learning to another partner, and that partner obviously has to satisfy quality conditions, etc. And the most common model that you might be familiar with is local authorities commission local providers to deliver community learning, family learning, English and maths, ESOL, etc. And there's still quite a lot of subcontracting, less than there was before, and it's now subject to a lot more controls, particularly in terms of quality and compliance. The other main source of funding for adult learners in England is advanced learner loans. That's set at about £480 million a year. There's been a big underspend on that. It funds level 3 and above programmes for adults, but there's been a fall generally in demand across all age groups other than the 19 to 23-year-old, and particularly amongst disadvantaged communities, there's been poor take-up. So for example, if an adult wants to do an access course and they're 25, 26 years old, or a level 3 diploma or a level 4 certificate, they would tend to take out a loan to pay the fee. Now, I'm going to focus on the adult education budget, but if any time you want to ask about loans, then you can do so. Now, at the moment, if you're looking at a range of provision, including essential digital skills qualifications, functional skills, ESOL, whatever your employability skills, whatever you want to offer, there are other sources of funding, and the National Skills Fund is particularly relevant with post-COVID recovery. So it's been funding major programs to get unemployed people back into learning. It's helping to fund different types of provision that helps those who need to upskill and retrain, particularly those who are at threat of unemployment. The communities and local government, very important for funding a lot of activities at that local level and in the voluntary sector. Some of you might be familiar with Job Centre Plus programs, particularly for the unemployed, as well as what's coming from what was, of course, the European Social Fund, which will see itself out, but it will be replaced by some new strategic structural funds that the government's intending to introduce. And there's other schemes around. You've most likely heard about Kickstart, which is a way of giving long-term unemployed, 16 to 24, at least a 6-month work placement with an employer, where the government pays the employer the minimum wage for that placement, as well as help additional funding to help out with training, PPE, administration, etc. But we're going to focus on the adult education budget, because that's the primary means by which the essential digital skills qualification is being funded. Now, what is the adult education budget actually funding? Well, there's always what we call technical issues around the way that the AB is structured. A large chunk of it is what we call formula funded, and essentially this is adult skills, particularly leading to an externally accredited qualification, such as the essential digital skills qualification, functional skills, speaking, listening, ESOL, employability skills at level 1 or entry 3, whatever you're offering. But that also includes, at the national level, programs for adults where the primary purpose of the program is to give the adult a work placement with then things like English and maths, ESOL wrapped round it, employability skills wrapped round it. But the primary purpose is to give that adult who's 19 to 24 a placement with 1 or 2 employers that gets them into the world of work with a line of sight to an apprenticeship, for example. And these are called traineeships. So the formula funded covers a lot of different aspects, from pre-entry right up to level 3, for example, access courses, which adults might be doing up to the age of 23, funded by the adult education budget. And it uses a formula, and I'll describe the formula very quickly using the essential digital skills qualification example. But that is information that's collected on all of your learners. So if you are seeking to be funded or are currently funded through the AB, you know that you have to keep information on every individual learner and every individual learning aim that they undertake. And this record is called the individualized learner record. That has all the basic information that justifies the funding for that learner, and also gives the government and the Department for Education information on who are the learners, what are they studying, what kind of backgrounds have they got, so it has all that key information. But a large chunk of AAB is also non-formula funded, and that just simply uses the information that you as a provider give about the totality of your expenditure, broken down by usually month, with based on how much you're claiming each month, with the reconciliation maybe during the year and at the end of the year. And this includes things like community learning, which of course is very often non-regulated learning, has a lot of programs for those that might be furthest away from learning, like family learning, family English, family maths, working with disadvantaged communities, working with people with mental health issues, working with troubled families, a whole lot of different types of provision, which is not using the formula, but tends to use the expenditure that you make each year on all of those programs that you offer. And in there is also learner support. This is the discretionary support that you provide to adults who might find it difficult to get access to learning unless there's things like childcare provided. So that's what discretionary learner support. Or if they've got hardship needs, they can't afford the books or the materials that are needed. This was classically exemplified during COVID, wasn't it? With adults who had to move to remote learning. Many of us had to provide us access to IT equipment as well as to the internet. And that was based on hardship. It also takes account of things like residential provision that might be needed. So there's a bit of what we call formula funded and non-formula funded, but together they make up the adult education budget. Now, the community learning aspect of this is not to be diminished in any way. And that's why I've put a couple of things in there, just for those of you who are predominantly community learning providers or working with, for example, local authority, third sector organizations, WEA, whatever, is that this is a very important aspect of the adult education budget. So it's helping people of different ages, backgrounds, gain skills, reconnect, all of those things, which of course we're in new challenges, new chances. But the ESFA is very keen to ensure that that community learning continues, funded by AB, even if it's delegated or devolved now to some of those authorities such as Greater London, Greater Manchester. But it's helping to find to help people who are furthest away from learning and employment to find an active role in wider society or into the workforce. But you can see there the justification for running programs such as English, Maths, ESOL, and that I think has now got to be extended to including essential digital skills. You know, in the modern world, you need those digital skills for your own integration into society, for community development, communicating with other people, and of course increasingly for employment. And I was talking to a provider this morning who is using the essential digital skills at level 1 as a very important aspect of the way that they're encouraging people who work in the hard trades, in construction such as plumbing, what do you call it, trowel trades, brickwork, to say that increasingly a lot of that is now being done online in terms of design, purchase, planning, drawing, etc. And that was quite a challenge for those people that were often quite skilled in those areas, but hadn't got the essential digital skills to move over to that much more digitized approach. And I think that community learning has got a lot still to do with progressing people to formal learning, improving their health and well-being, including their mental health, as well as developing stronger communities. And think how essential digital skills qualifications enable and empower individuals and the communities that they're in to be able to maneuver their way through a much more complex world. Even the ESFA or the devolved authorities see how that important it is. But of course, they do set conditions. If you're delivering community learning within the AEB, it is important that you still try and make sure that the individual understands that sometimes they have to make a personal investment. That's not the case with the essential digital skills, but it might be if that person's doing essential digital skills plus employability skills or health and social care, where they might have to invest their own. This is known as the pounds plus. The pound is the public pound. Whatever we get from the individual is their plus bit. But also to make sure that we understand that they still have to put in that data about what people are studying, such as, is it family, English, maths, whatever. But the expectation that if you're involved in community learning inside the AB, that you're working with your key partners, the health organisations, the voluntary organisations, Job Centre Plus. But I think all the way through, the assumption is that people can use community learning and that approach, which often non-accredited, less, if you want, stressful, to then access qualifications in English, maths, digital skills, ESOL, employability skills, and then in the vocational areas that they're interested in doing, and that progression is built in. So there's a little bit about community learning inside the adult education budget. So what's its principal purpose? Engaging adults, giving them the skills and learning they need for work, apprenticeship, further learning, and as I said also, to be more effective citizens, to function effectively in their family or in their community. So it's about giving them qualifications. It doesn't always have to be a qualification. In other words, it can include other forms of learning, which of course we'll talk a wee bit in a minute about. So it does engage those adults in things like preparation for life, re-engagement, independent living, particularly if they've got learning difficulties and or disabilities, as well as employability skills. And you as a provider or the partner that you're working with, if you secure AAB funding, got the freedom and flexibility to deliver programs that meet needs of your individual learners and the communities that they come from. And that can include a whole range of activities that we've just described. It does have, in terms of the formula-driven bit, the ability to fund qualifications, in particular from entry right up to level 3, and obviously non-regulated learning. And as I said, in 2020-21, just over 50% of the AB is delegated either to Greater London Authority or the 7 what we call mayoral combined authorities, of which Greater Manchester, Liverpool, West Midlands are examples. And you might be functioning as a centre in one of those devolved authorities, in which case there is a lot more flexibility, even than at the national level, to support your provision. And in this case, your essential digital skills qualification offer would be funded by the AEB still, using more than likely the same formula, but delegated through the combined authorities, who can sometimes vary the rules and rates. For example, in London, AEB gets, in many cases, 10% more funding from the Greater London Authority than, for example, other learners in other parts of the country, because that's seen as such a priority to ensure that there's enough resource to fund the extensive needs that there are in Greater London. So you can see that there's, even though we've got a national system and a national methodology, there are variations around it depending where you're located. So what are the main groups of people that are funded by the AB? The first group is all of those people who are aged 19 to 23 who haven't yet qualified on their first full level 2, which is equivalent of 5 GCSEs, or the first full level 3, which is equivalent of 2 A levels. So these are equivalences in vocational terms. They are always fully funded, so they don't have to find a fee. They get 100% of the course fully funded. Don't ever use the expression free. It's just simply say that the course is fully funded, or in other words, the fee is 100% remitted. Now this extends to English and maths, which were in the original national entitlement. So any learner who's 19 and over who hasn't yet achieved the GCSE grade 4 to 9 in English and maths is always entitled to do another English and maths program, functional skills or GCSEs, or stepping stone qualifications in English and maths, which I know some of you offer, up to the point where they achieve the grade 4 to 9. Now that's now been extended because of the big issues we've got with digital poverty across the country, large numbers of people who can't access digital skills, who haven't got those digital skills. That's now been extended to include digital skills entitlement for everyone that's 19 and over. But you must deliver the qualifications that the government, through the ESFA or the delegated authority, are rating as quality qualifications of some value. And this is updated regularly on the thing called the hub. So if you're in a larger provider or centre, maybe someone looking after data will tell you all about the hub. But the hub is basically where all the information about qualifications which are eligible to be funded, including the essential digital skills qualification, all that data is held. And one of you has already told me that it's the same as the Learning Aims Reference System, the LARS, as it used to be called. And of course, the other thing is that not only are they funding those entitlements, these are fully funded programs, so they use up the AAB for those people who are entitled, but they extend that now to also include people who are unemployed. So whether they're 19 to 23 or older than 23, that's 24 and over, they are unemployed as long as they're doing those programs which are eligible to be fully funded. Otherwise, they would have to find 50% of the cost of a course. When we talk about a co-funded rate means that the learner has to find 50% of the cost of the course, the basic cost of the course, as a fee. Now, they might either pay it all up front or they might pay it in installments, but that was the normal assumption for adult education budget. Now, in the last few years, we've realized that a lot of adults who are not unemployed are on low wages, and any one of these courses that we might offer, other than those who are already in the entitlements, might, 50% is maybe too much. They've been entitled to be fully funded in the last few years, as long as their wages are less than currently £17,374.50. And that's got to be evidenced, by the way, by pay slips, etc. And that obviously is very important for low-paid learners. It's made a big difference. Those of you who have been involved in delivering ESOL, you'll find that a lot of ESOL learners fit into this category because often they're part-time, etc., or they're in low-paid jobs. And that means that that learner doesn't have to find 50% of the cost of the course, which for ESOL was, of course, a big barrier. Now, there is variation. For example, Greater London has a much higher minimum wage or level of wage below which you will be entitled to be fully funded, and similarly with Greater Manchester Combined Authority. So there's a lot of variation around that entitlement. So what are the legal entitlements? These are the basic programs which learners are entitled to in England to be fully funded and don't have to find 50%. So first level 2, first level 3, but only for those age groups who are 19 to 23. English and maths, and that includes, by the way, functional skills, stepping stone qualifications in English and maths, as long as they're on the hub, and of course the new entitlement, information technology or digital skills, up to and including level 1. And this is where the essential digital skills qualification comes in, because that's the only qualification at the moment which is eligible to be fully funded at entry 3 and level 1. So you can therefore offer a learner a legal entitlement, such as digital skills, alongside something which they might have to find in some cases the funding for, the co-funding, unless of course they're unemployed or their wage is below a certain level. So it could be employability skills, it could be ESOL. And I know some of you definitely as providers have been doing this, thinking about putting ESOL together with digital skills, because you're already doing it ESOL with functional skills in English and maths. So those are the legal entitlements in England. Can I just ask, are there any questions at this stage about how the AEB funds adults through those legal entitlements? And that includes, of course, the essential digital skills qualification. So a barrier is already removed, i.e. the learner does not have to find 50% of the cost of that course. Are there any questions at this stage? Any comments or questions? Is this making sense? Sandra, the good question. I'm going to pick this up because actually in the funding guidance, it does say, this is for 2020-21, that pre-entry level digital skills will also be funded through the AAB. So there's some good news on that. But of course, they've got to be mapped over to the digital skills standards. So that's the only condition. And some of the awarding bodies, I think Ascentis, I'm not sure if any others, are actually putting on a pre-entry digital skills. But it's a good question, but I'll look at those conditions in a minute with you. Thank you for that. Great question. Now, this table, don't worry about it. It appears every year. Basically, it's a summary of who in England is entitled to what in terms of being fully funded or where they are necessary being, or where they will have to find a fee. The problem with all of this is that at national level, this is applied. There are variations at local level, such as, for example, I said in Greater London, which often includes other people in the fully funded categories, because that's part of the, if you want, the delegated powers that they have. But you can see there it is. Right, the digital skills entitlements there. The essential digital skills qualification up to including level 1, fully funded. Now, the big issue about this is that was predominantly entry 3 and level 1. As you said, I've talked about pre-entry. It's fundable, but the one big issue is there might be some of the devolved authorities which say, no, we really want you to focus on entry 3, because entry 3 actually is supposed to cover everything at entry level, as well as level 1. So you can get a variation. And I think that's the point Sandra's just made. So thanks for that point. The other point to note is that the definition of unemployment is not our definition. It's the funding agency's definition that you've got to follow. So this has been updated for the most recent figures. So it's job seekers allowance, employment support allowance, universal credit, as long as they're not above that threshold. But the other thing to note is, in addition to these categories of learners, who particularly over 24 would be fully funded for programs, you've got to understand that there are some what we call discretions, that a provider can use their allocation of A/B to say to other learners who might be in receipt of another state benefit and who have earnings below that threshold that we just described, but not on universal credit or job seekers or employment, but another one which is means tested, you can use your discretion to fully fund them, but it comes out of obviously the local, out of your allocation. But it's got to be done on the justification that that learner has to be fully funded for that program because they're seeking to become, to get a job and a job with training. It's particularly important for ESOL learners that you understand that. However, the receipt of low wage certainly has covered a lot more learners. So I've described that. But again, you cannot fully fund or apply a fee remission of 100% unless you've got evidence. So it's a wage slip within 3 months or a current employment contract. But those are not the only sources of evidence that you might need. I've got another question just coming here. I'll pick that one up. Yeah, and that's exactly the point. I'll come back to the entry level 3 being set, to too high a level for those people perhaps at pre-entry and level 1. But again, don't forget, there are other budgets you can use, which, for example, might use non-regulated learning in digital skills, such as the community learning, which allows you that progression, etc. But as long as you've got a community learning allocation, or you're a subcontractor that delivers community learning to a prime, so you're going to make sure that you meet those conditions. But good point there raised. Again, if you're a provider with already getting an A/B allocation, question I have to say is, how are you promoting the low wage waiver to more and more of your adults? Because then that removes, other barriers to learning, so that they might be able to pick up essential digital skills plus something like employability skills, ESOL, or something like that. So the other thing to note is that within the devolved authorities, and even if you're not in a devolved authority, even if you're outside of Greater London or Manchester or Liverpool or West Midlands, there is local flexibility around the ESFAs, the national contracts that you might have, which allows you to locally design learning, which can be qualifications and non-regulated learning. So it could include the pre-entry digital skills, and that can support progression to full level 2, retraining or upskill those people that are already qualified at level 2 but are out of work and need to retrain. So progression up to full level 2 would be entry and level 1. And of course, entry can include pre-entry. These can be qualification units which are specified in the hub, including ESOL. That can also be non-regulated learning. So well spotted. A couple of you have said, yeah, we can use non-regulated learning as long as it meets the quality assurance. It cannot just be, the learner's completed 30 hours and we'll call it pre-entry. digital skills. It's got to be something which recognises and records their progress achievement. So there's got to be that, what we call quality wrapped around it in terms of what was the learning objective, how does that match over to the essential digital skills standards, and how do you record that that person has achieved it and then able to progress. So the local flexibility allows you to do non-regulated learning as long as the programs are recognised for the purposes of local flexibility. So you could use it alongside the legal entitlement. So you could put on an employability skills, which is eligible to be funded through local flexibility, alongside the national entitlement for a learner, and they can do those two learning aims together. So you can see that there's different categories of people who you can apply the local flexibility. And this is, again, trying to extend the reach of the adult education budget to those adults that might not have found some of those other things attractive, or it can really reflect the issues that maybe are more important for in your locality or in your sub-region. So you can use local flexibilities to recruit learners that might otherwise not be interested, as long as obviously you've got some kind of RAP in place, some kind of quality assurance in place that does that. Now, I've talked about non-regulated learning, and I know that, you know, in some providers, it almost disappeared, and I don't really know why. It was like, let's focus, everyone should be on a regulated qualification or whatever. But actually, when you look at it, if you look at the different types of need that you might have, from independent living, employability skills, community learning. Some people might need little tasters that get them into regulated qualifications. And of course, in many cases, you'll find that there are significant gaps in knowledge and skills among certain members of your local community or who you're working with. And these can be very important to get those people that are furthest away from learning. The only problem is that, and I don't know how many of you use non-regulated learning, could you just from those of you who do have provision that is funded by the AB, could you just do a show of hands? How many of you are using non-regulated learning? Just a show of hands. How many of you are using non-regulated learning? We've got one or two. Thank you. Thanks, Sandra. Just a couple of you. Yeah. I mean, the thing is, it does, and if you're thinking about, you know, becoming a funded provider, don't ignore the benefits of non-regulated learning, but make sure that it doesn't do any of the following things. It doesn't just simply allow a person to meet visa requirements. That's just not on. It mustn't meet something where there's already an agreed concession. So, you know, if we know that people have got to have a certain qualification to enter a trade, then you can't replace that with non-regulated learning. It can't be just for one employer with one set of employees. It mustn't be, and it mustn't be things like an induction program. That should be part of the learner's experience, whether you're a local community provider, college provider, or independent learning provider. And it mustn't be the non-regulated version of a regulated qualification. Now, if a regulated qualification doesn't have a pre-entry element to it, then you can run that as non-regulated learning. See, if there was a pre-entry element, then that would be more difficult. But if there isn't, then there's an opening there. It mustn't be above notional level 2. So we don't find many copies of that. But again, a lot of non-regulated learning has got the ball rolling, and then eventually that's become a regulated qual when there's been enough demand for it. And if it is at notional level 2, by the way, it's got to be a technical provision. It can't be generic, and it can't be things like employability skills or community or basic skills. I think what is important is to make sure that if you are using any non-regulated pre-entry essential digital skills, that you do have that RAPA process in place. And if you want to know more about it, there's you can go to the Learning and Work Institute, and they'll give you the sort of models that basically captures the outcomes in a way that meets the needs for audit and inspection. The other thing to note, and I think this is potentially one of the biggest markets for essential digital skills, particularly at level 1. I wouldn't say that's necessarily the case for everyone. I think it would be both entry 3 and level 1, is basically where those people who are in work. Because we talk a lot about the furthest away from learning, we talk about the unemployed, but what about the level of digital skills of people in the workplace? And because it's part of the entitlement, it can be delivered to people in the workplace. And I've been talking to a subcontractor of a local authority that actually found, interestingly enough, one of the biggest demands for digital skills was staff in the local authority. So there's been a sort of real, reversal there of the situation, of the relationship. But however, you've got to make sure that this isn't specific to the needs of the employer. So if you deliver digital skills, but it's not just because those people work in a certain function, or that's part of their job, it's more generic, then it's okay. Or don't deliver it at the employer's premises. So you can deliver it either virtually, or you can deliver it at your own centre. And I think, therefore, it is quite an important, if you want, dimension of essential digital skills, and its reach is to be extended to people in the workplace. And that's funded through the AEB. So I think, again, why not, if you're working already with trade unions, why not do that so that you'd be doing functional skills along with digital skills or whatever. Now, the other thing to note is that, one or two of you do operate in devolved authorities. The government's view is to devolve chunks of the AEB to local people, to local organisations, the combined authorities, which have got an elected mayor. They've got full responsibility for the adult education budget in their area, how it's distributed, what it's spent against, what its priorities are. This is very much about meeting the needs of the locality. Now, what's been added this year is North of Tyne. Next year, Sheffield City region, and I think West Yorkshire is the next one. And you can see that they obviously will give you a slightly different flavour. They will still have to fund fully essential digital skills qualifications, because that's a national entitlement. What rate they might fund that might be higher than the national rate. That's up to their discretion, their flexibility. But there are a lot of opportunities provided if you're working in a devolved authority. And here are just some examples. The low wage waiver in London is a lot more than national. London increased the base rates for English and maths levels 1 and 2 in functional skills by 10% above the national rate. So there's been all kinds of innovative approaches to digital skills for the unemployed, which are a part of the London Innovation Fund. So you can, I'm just using London as an example there, a lot of different things that could be provided around the national programme by operating in a devolved area. How many of you, by the way, are operating in devolved areas? How many of you as participants, again, a show of hands, how many of you are actually based as a centre in London, Greater Manchester, the West Midlands, or one of those areas that I've just identified? Got a few hands going up? Yep. So again, if you're thinking of entering into the funded market and seeking funding, then again, you will realise that there's another dimension, which is that the contracting is done not only at national level by ESFA, but also at local level through different procurement. For example, if in a local area they find that there's not enough of a provision, they might go out to a tender to procure new providers, what they call market entry. But a word of warning, those providers will have to have quality, they'll have to have some kind of track record of working with those types of learners, or they know skill areas around those qualification areas. So it's not just a free entry point. There's a lot of, if you want, hurdles to jump over. So how does this formula work? Well, the formula works basically using a thing called the single activity matrix. Now, basically this is, depending on how many hours you plan for the activity will determine how much funding that activity. So if you're offering an ESOL qualification and you're offering so many hours, you look at the matrix and that will tell you how much funding. If you're offering an employability skills, you look at it. Now, usually the awarding body will tell you what range of hours that qualification should be in. Now, those hours will either be guided learning, where you do all of the learning face-to-face with the learner. You guide every hour of that program. Or it could be using what we call total qualification time, where a proportion of the hours you do face-to-face and you guide the learning, or you do it online but guide it. But some of the hours the learner does by themselves using learning materials, using a virtual learning, viewing webinars, or something like that. Now, the matrix will fund regulated qualifications like functional skills, essential digital skills, etc., GCSEs, A levels, level 2 plumbing, whatever, as well as you can use it for the non-regulated provision where you use the planned hours. So what funding for an individual learning aim, such as the Essential Digital Skills qualification, will be the weighted rate of the qualification. Some qualifications get more per hour than other qualifications. Some qualifications, such as engineering, construction, will have a weight of greater than 1. See, 1 is given to all quals as a base, but then greater than 1, and that can be things like engineering, construction, horticulture. We then say, wait a minute, where does the learner come from? That's known as the disadvantage uplift. Their postal code, the 27% of the postal codes in England carry a disadvantage uplift. They're the poorest 20%, 27% of postal codes. And that also reflects that that learner that you attract to do essential digital skills that might be coming from one of those disadvantaged, socially deprived postal codes will cost you more to induct, to train, to support, etc. But then the other aspect of this is known as area cost uplift. That is, where is the provider based? And basically, if you're in London or the Southeast, you will have a whole lot of higher costs per hour. Your staff cost more per hour, as well as some of your overheads. So we use a learning aim, and an individual could be doing more than one learning aim. They could be doing essential digital skills plus ESOL. Each one of those will have its own funding attached to it. And as I said, it could be either done by hours or by what we call guided learning hours, or by qualification time. If you deliver, and this is very important for adults, and I'm assuming you're going to be delivering the Essential Digital Skills qualification partly online, it makes no difference whether it's face-to-face, online, as long as you've got evidence of the learning taking place and that learning has been recorded and progress is being recorded and monitored, then you get the same level of funding. There's no distinction. That's something to know. But we do use a disadvantage uplift that's slightly out of date. The younger people now, we use the 2019. It's still a little bit behind with adults. But the other thing to note, and this is important, is that on an adult on an essential digital skills qualification, 80% of the funding is attached to them being retained. In other words, staying on the program to the end of the program. 20% is what you get for achieving the Essential Digital Skills qualification at entry 3 or level 1. So you can see that if you don't retain learners, or you don't achieve, then your revenue or your income or what you're being passed on from your subcontracting partner, the prime, would be reduced. Also, for any provision that isn't fully funded, we assume the learner has to find half the cost of the course. So when you put that learner's information in on their individualized learner record, if it doesn't show that they're entitled to fee remission, it automatically only gives you half of whatever the rate is listed on the matrix, and you have to find the other half by charging the learner. Also though, learners can get support if they have a learning need, that's called learning support, and they can also get discretionary support if they've got childcare or hardship, that's called learner support. So here's the matrix that we use. Don't be too put off by it, but I'll give you a simple model. Let's just take a nice little 30-hour employability skills course. There, see, that's the number of hours, 30. Employability skills are all weighted at A, which is A, that's their program weighting A. So if I attract and recruit one adult onto that, the most I will earn, as long as they stay and as long as they pass, is £150 for that one adult. If I've got 10 adults in that class, I'll earn 10 times £150. If I was doing 240-hour catering course, catering's weighted at C, just look at this, 240 hours catering course. One adult who starts and finishes that course, particularly if they're fully funded, would earn me £1,645. That's before I knew which postal code they came from, or before I knew I was delivering it in London. So that's, and 80% of that funding is attached to retention and 20% to achievement. So just be wary of that. Got another question coming in? Yeah, again, if you've got, if you want to do a functional skill in English, here the rates are set as a matter of policy, as a matter of, not a mother, a matter of policy. So it makes no difference how many hours you put in, it will always be funded at this rate. So functional skills English, 724, unless of course you're in London where you get more than that. That's using the variability that a devolved authority can. So you can see that if the old functional skill in IT weighted at B, 336. Functional skills entry level in maths, interestingly enough, 941. Maths is always funded at the same rate as English when it comes to functional skills, except for one, and that is entry level maths, whether it be level 1, level 2, or level 3, it's £941, because the expectation is that you're going to need a smaller class size to deal with the range of needs that you might have at entry level maths. So again, some qualifications have got fixed rate, others it's more variable. So someone's just asked me, what about a 240-hour ESOL course? Well, 240-hour ESOL course, £12.65. Now, if that ESOL was fully funded because the person was below wage, the minimum wage, that wage waiver, or you use your discretion and they might be on another means tested benefit other than JSA or whatever, then you'd get £1,265 for that learner, only if they were retained to the end and they passed. So I think it's important to see. So for example, I've been working with quite a small provider recently. This is what their earnings are from AAB. They're offering these types of workshops, 5-hour workshop and a 50-hour course. So they're using a little starter and then a 50-hour progression. This isn't in essential digital skills. It's around another set of skill areas. And basically, if you look at a 5-hour workshop, go back into the grid, 5 hours, £35, 50 hours, on that, £300. So they've got 100 learners doing the 5-hour workshop, 3,500, 80 learners doing the 50-hour course, 24,000. So they would expect, as long as they got 100% retention and achievement, to earn £27,500 before knowing which postal codes, which would add to some of these. And if this was in London, right, if it was in the centre of London, they could be at a 30% uplift for their location to that 27,000. So another £9,000 would be coming into that provider, as long as they've got 100% retention achievement. Now, I know one of you is already asking me, what about if you're a subcontractor? If you're a subcontractor, then you wouldn't necessarily be getting those rates because your prime, that's the main contractor, would keep a proportion of this to cover their management and monitoring cost. I'm smiling. That could be 15% of this, it could be 20%. So if any of you do enter into subcontracts, particularly subcontracts where the value of your subcontract is less than £100,000 in a year, you've got to understand that you don't get all of that funding. Some of it is retained by the main provider, the prime, who has got the contract or got the allocation, and then you'd be getting a proportion of that money that I've just described there. Well, I think, again, if you're a relatively small organization, you might say, well, it's not worth us becoming directly funded. Can we find a good partner to work with where they could subcontract to us? And that would be okay if particularly you're offering a niche or you're working with learners that would not normally be attracted to that main provider, but you have to go through all of the quality assurance, etc. And I'll give you some hints and tips on that at the very end. But I've got another concern, and the other concern is, to some extent, the government, either the ESFA or some of the devolved authorities, want to reduce the large number of quite small providers in certain areas. So, for example, during the devolution, during the procurement, some of the smaller providers were pushed out of the market because it was just too small. Now, some of them have joined with bigger organizations, and basically the staff have moved over, or they've offered a different type of service to that bigger organization, such as learning materials, or lent some of the staff to them, and they've worked in different ways. But again, there's a lot of scrutiny at the moment of subcontracting. So if you don't want to do it in your own right, you just don't think it's going to be, well, 150 could be quite an interesting number. So I certainly would want to have maybe a chat with Evie about that, and what might be the best thing. We can do this outside of today. But that's just to give you some idea of the way that contracts and the value of contracts. The other thing to note, by the way, is that because essential digital skills is part of the entitlement, all adults, including those at work, because I recently was talking to a provider who says the only adults that can be fully funded for English, maths and digital skills have got to be unemployed. So where did you get that? Oh, we were told it's any adult who hasn't yet achieved GCSE grade 4 or higher in English and maths, or any adult who hasn't yet got essential digital skills at level 1 is eligible to be fully funded. Now, the English and maths GCSEs are both funded at £811 per adult. Remember, 80% retention, 20% achievement. Those are the base rates. And functional skills at £724 for English and maths, except for entry level, which is £924. And the new digital skills qualification, obviously, which have been available since August, they're funded again at fully funded at entry level. That's entry level 3 and level 1. Now, I'm going to share that with you. Again, this should be a major aspect of anything. Particularly if you're thinking of going into entering the AAB market, is focus on where those big areas of demand are: English, maths, digital skills, employability skills, and such like. So the digital entitlement basically says any individual, and this is nationally, so it does apply in devolved authorities as well, 19 and older, assessed at below, and by the way, there's no maximum age. You've got to make sure that the assessment occurs before you can claim that that person is going to be fully funded through an entitlement, right? That is part of the control and part of the condition. And that can be the essential digital skills up to including level 1. Now, here's the key bit that one of you raised earlier. It will fully fund non-regulated learning for learners, including those assessed at pre-entry level with significant learning difficulties and or disabilities, because that can be part of a personalised learning programme, where assessment is identified the learner cannot undertake provision identified above. So when you've got that initial assessment, and as I said, some awarding bodies have already done this, you've actually got this job done for you. A lot of the learners will be at pre-entry level. Not only will they have, in some cases, learning difficulties, that English might not be the primary, might not be the language spoken at home, and there could be other issues. It could be mental health issues or whatever. But you must make sure that these conditions are adhered to. In other words, you cannot go into the delivery of essential digital skills qualifications without initial assessment, diagnostic assessment, enrolling the person at the level at which they're assessed and able to provide evidence, and then do the ongoing support, and then evidence all of this in the evidence file or the learner file. So these assessments must take place, at the beginning, during, and obviously at the end as well. And each awarding body will have its different conditions it applies to you. I think Adele, I think it's a brilliant thing that you've said about, well, the Good Things Foundation. I'm sure they're going to tell you that they have developed a lot of these assessment tools, and whether they're can be applied at pre-entry would be a nice, if not already, it would be a nice piece of work to do. And I think the demand's there. And here's an example of digital skills. We've got Learner A, one of ours, because we actually have several hundred people on these programs at the moment. Brilliant. Thanks very much, Sandra, who's telling everyone that the awarding organisations have already got some assessments attached to these calls. I know we have. When I say we, at a census. But here's an example of Learner A. Their entry level 3, it's 50 guided learning hours. Now, the rate, by the way, is set at 300. So if you look at most of the awarding bodies, they'll vary the hours between 45 and 60. The average is expected to be 50 guided learning hours or 50 total qualification hours. So it's £300. That's the weighted rate. Okay, so it's 300. It's weighted at A. Now, this learner wants to sign up for a 3-month course. As soon as we know that they want to sign up for 3 months, we say, right, in effect, 80% of the funding is attached to them being retained over the 3 months. That's £240. 20% for the achieving the level 3. That's £60. But as a provider, we change the 3 months to 4 months and then get a double retention payment or earning in month 1. So you'll notice that when you put that learner into the ILR and then calculate the funding for each one of the 3 months, you'll get a double on program payment, which is the retention payment, in month 1. So instead of getting 60, you get 2 60s, that's 120. Then it's 60 in month 2, 60 in month 3. But at the end of each one of those months, we must know that the learner is still active. And if that learner left you at the end of month 1 and didn't get to month 2 or month 3, you'd only earn the first of that month's earning if they had at least attended for 2 weeks. This would be a short course. A short course is anything less than 24 weeks. Any course of less than 24 weeks, the learner must at least attend till the 2nd week. They're retained to the 2nd week, they become a start, and therefore you can activate the funding. On a longer course, that's more than 24 weeks, they have to be with you for 42 days, not 14 days, but 42 days. This is what we call the start condition. Not every learner that you enroll earns any money if they don't get to either day 14 if they're on a shorter course, or day 42 if they're a longer course. If this learner left you after the end of month 2 and didn't complete the entry-level qualification, you'd have earned month 1, month 2, but you would have lost month 3, and then you'd have lost the achievement. We've got a question here. What about if they achieve before the end of month 3? Thanks for that. If they achieve the entry level 3 at, say, at the end of month 2, then you get all the funding. You get month 1, 2, 3, and achievement, because as the achievement activates all the prior retention or on program funding as well. So good question there, if you've got an early achiever. Yeah. And that's great. Good set up webinars with awarding organizations, for example, Gateway. And thanks very much for the promo. Great, no problem. Yes, and I think Evie, you've also said that the assessment tools are on TLM. So I think the other thing to note, by the way, is can you see how important all of those stages of initial diagnostic assessment are, ensuring that the person's on the right program, the right level, but also maybe the right length. 3 months might be too short. You know, someone might need longer. It might not suit their lifestyle. We've had some learners complete this qualification in 2 months. Now that we're assuming that they were at the right level, which was entry 3. Obviously, if we assessed them already at level 1, then obviously we'd have to offer them an alternative offer in terms of level 2 and 3, which in some cases would mean that they have to find 50% of the cost of the program, because the entitlement only is up to and including level 1. So, okay, thank you. So any questions about the way that digital skills qualification is funded? And this is basically coming out the AB. So if you're working with a prime, they might want you to deliver, 200, 300 learners. Then obviously you would know roughly what the value of each one of those learners was if they stayed and they completed the program. This is before obviously knowing whether the learner comes from a disadvantaged postal code or whether the delivery was in London. And you can see the importance of the quality here in terms of retention and achievement. So what do adults get that helps them to complete their programs? Well, it is often misunderstood, but every single adult with a learning difficulty or disability is entitled, if they're funded through the AB or through loans or on apprenticeships, to get learning support. And this extends to those who are 19 and over, haven't got an education healthcare plan, or anyone is obviously aged 25 and over. And it's available to all learners funded by the AB, including basic skills and ESOL. And again, I was talking to a provider who said, well, our ESOL learners can't draw down learning support because it's already funded through ESOL. No, it isn't. If an ESOL learner's got an individual learning support, a mental health issue, a disability, a learning difficulty, maybe they haven't even got a written language in their own language, then that's all eligible for learning support. What does this mean? Well, on top of what you get, so, let's just say that this learner that I had here, that learner, we identified that they had a learning difficulty, dyslexia, could be a learning, it could be a learning difficulty of some sort, or hearing impairments that way. We could claim for each month that we're providing learning support, another £150 for that individual learner. So you can start to see how the funding for the learner reflects the not only the qualification the learner is doing, but the individual circumstances of that learner. And that's what the basis of AAB funding is. So it's a fixed monthly rate for adults of £150 per month that you provide the support. However, let me just add, from the audit point of view, I would want to know that they got their analysis or assessment of need, even if they self-disclosed, and that we had a learning support plan that was going to be offered each month, that we knew that while they were doing the essential digital skills qual, what would be the support, and how would that support close the attainment gap for that learner or improve their learning. If any learner needs more than £150 in a month, the provider can claim this through a thing called excess learning support, and that's done through a separate activity. Don't worry too much about the technicalities of it, but again, if you're in an organisation that's already drawing down funding, sometimes it's useful to ask your MI. Again, your management information team or your data team. What kinds of support needs have you identified for adult learners, and how can ALS, additional learning support, that's for adults, help to fund or to improve access, retention and achievement? So again, the Essential Digital Skills Qual is funded, yeah, but so is any learning support you provide for that learner who has either disclosed the learning difficulty and or disability, or you've actually identified it. And for those adults that need support in terms of hardship, or they've got children, etc., that's a different category of support. Again, that's attached to the provider as long as they've identified that, but it's not formula funded, tends to be based on your pattern of expenditure in the past. And that includes, by the way, response to COVID-19, because discretionary learner support has been during COVID-19 used to support for online learning. And that could have been in things like paying for people's internet access, lending them equipment, etc. All of these have been aspects of learner support as opposed to learning support. Again, there's some roles that attach to that. By the way, this is not an entitlement. It's at your discretion. So you've got to know what levels of hardship people have got, what their income levels. You can set those, and that's the flexibility you've got. And once you've used it, you've used it. So I think there's difficulties. One little condition, no more than 5% of that must go on administration costs. If you're grant funded, like a college or local authority, it comes to you every month. If you're an independent learning provider, then it's basically paid separately to you against what you actually use each month. You're always paid 1 month in arrears if you're not a college or a local authority for AEB. It's basically payment on actual rather than payment on what we call a profile, which is what you would have got over the year spread over 12 months. If you're an independent learning provider, a small provider, you tend to be paid on actuals. So those are all the main aspects of an adult education budget. How it's made up, what it's used for, local flexibilities, low wage waivers, how it's devolved in some, how it's basically about activating adults into learning, how it's being applied for the Essential Digital Skills Qualification, which has got a fixed value of £300 per learner, 80% retention, 20% achievement, but those learners can also draw down learning support if that's been identified. That's basically what the adult education budget is about, and that's how Essential Digital Skills Qualifications are fundable through the public purse. Any other questions just on the adult education budget? I mean, I'm used to it. I've worked with the adult education budget and its different forms before the adult skills budget, so I'm quite familiar with the technicalities. And of course, I've got to be honest. We were the organisation I'm involved in now on a only part-time basis was the biggest subcontractor. We started off very small, like some of you, and then grew our provision to the point where I think this year alone, Learning Curve Group has got over 100,000 individual learners. Originally as a subcontractor, so in other words, we were not big enough, we weren't getting the money directly, but now obviously we're one of the biggest directly funded providers, but that takes time. And I know that one or two of you are asking questions about how we do it, but I think the main thing is, do you understand the basic principles that underpin the thing known as the adult education budget? So that if you talk to another provider or talk to a college or a local authority, and they use all these expressions around adult education budget, retention, achievement, what's on the matrix, what's listed as a like GCSEs. Now you've got that common language. Is everyone comfortable with that common language? Everyone have answered the questions that you might have posed? Okay. Well, I've got one last slide. It might just help crystallize some ideas in your thinking, particularly if you're thinking about, well, what does this mean? Thanks for that feedback. Thank you. Is that I think, if anything, I have to be honest, 10 years ago, this would have been absolutely spot on for every single one of us. But because of what's already happened with devolution, what's happening with this thing known as the Register of Training Organisations, which if any of you have tried to get on, has been closed for about 3 years, is it's very hard at this point to become a publicly funded new provider in your own right. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't opportunities, but basically for the AB, which I've just been talking about, loans, you could have gone and got AB funding as a subcontractor, but you wouldn't have got 100% of any of those payments that I talked about before, because the prime would hold back 15, 20%, sometimes less, sometimes more, by the way, for what they call the management cost, the quality assurance and monitoring cost. And basically you'd have been left with enough just to do the direct delivery. But that's still available as long as the total value of any subcontract that you have, even if you have it from more than one direct funded prime, has not got to be any more than £100,000. You had to be on the register if it was above that. Now that register is being closed and it's going to be decommissioned from the 31st of July. I think there's going to be alternative entry opportunities for new providers, but they will always be on Gov.uk, that website. For example, there's been some new providers commissioned recently by the ESFA to deliver adult traineeships. That's the 19 to 24 age group. The traineeships, which can be 6 months long, could be as low as 6 weeks, as short as 6 weeks, where the main element is a placement with an employer. Right? There's no subcontracting allowed for loans, by the way, so don't venture that way. So there are I think there's going to have to be a new model which says, yeah, but we've got gaps, we've got niches, we've got, it needs something, that we can get some centres to come together. Maybe because they're very good at delivering essential digital skills qualifications, or ESOL, or employability skills, or family learning. And if they're not being commissioned by the local authority, which of course you can be, as long as your contracts are less than 100k with them, then we've got to have other entry points. And there have been those, for example, into traineeships. Brand new providers have come into traineeships, with not necessarily any track record of doing any publicly funded training before. Now that's so much the case for apprenticeships, because for apprenticeships you can at any time apply to become directly funded by getting onto the register of apprenticeship training providers. But again, you can either say, well, I'm going to be a provider, I'm going to do subcontracting, that's what we call the support route. But even if you get onto the register, there's no guarantee of funding, because you've got to have either the employer coming to you, or you're being there's no procurement anymore for apprenticeships, but you'd have to have an employer basically saying, I want you to deliver this apprenticeship for me. All employers are now using the apprenticeship service. So I think a couple of you have already commented, it's just not necessarily part of your vista or not part of your mission to do this. But you might be thinking about, well, can we offer a service such as, lending our expertise, lending our materials? I mean, that's how Learning Curve originally started. Not as a provider, we produced open learning materials and distance learning materials for health and social care and such sectors. And then we were asked to start to deliver it. So that's how we became a provider. If you are interested, then I suggest if you think it's part and parcel, you've got the capabilities, you've got a training or education record, you've got a track record of working with an awarding body, you've been working with the Good Things Foundation, then apply for what we call a provider reference number. You can get that from the UK Register of Learning Providers. You just have to give them some basic information, basically to tell them that you've not been in financial difficulties before, or invalid in terms of your registrations. Every single provider's got to have now an Information Commissioner's Office registration number. Again, you just go on there to apply for that, because you're going to hold records on individual learners. And then look out for opportunities either with the ESFA or with the Department for Education, or from a devolved authority. But can I just say, get those essential conditions right. If this is not part and parcel of your mission, you haven't got the scale, don't do it. But there'll be other things that you can offer. And certainly those of you might be, having a better knowledge of AEB and the way that adult learning is funded is certainly going to be helpful in more general terms. Any more questions or comments?
Thanks, Beach. I just want to ask a quick question, or a bit of advice, I suppose, because quite rightly, some of our organisations on today have said that perhaps this is just sort of too out of their reach. What we are finding is, I think the essential digital skills qualification is going to be really popular, because at the moment there's about 6 awarding bodies who are registered to deliver, but we know that there's quite a few still in the backlog waiting for their off-qual sign-off. So we know it's going to be a popular qual. But what we're hearing is some of the providers who wouldn't usually deliver this are kind of struggling a bit because of the learners. And Sandra really pulled upon the kind of pre-entry, the foundation skills they need to even get to start the entry level 3. So I suppose, do you have any advice on terms of, like you mentioned about, actually think about what services you could offer to those who get the prime contractors? Do you have any advice on sort of how you broker those relationships and how you make those relationships potentially work? And I suppose, how do you approach perhaps a provider that will be delivering the quals but lacks the experience of working with these particular learners? Do you have any tips on how potentially they could approach either the local authority or
a college or a private training provider?
Perhaps doing a building construction qualification, but now wants to put digital in, but doesn't have that expertise to teach that digital side. How could our experts from our centres, who have a lot of expertise in this, provide and broker those relationships?
I think that's a good question, Aniela, and I think that for me the difficulty here is the ESFA's definition of subcontracting, because subcontracting can be extended to include things like providing your staff on an agency basis. So if I was a small centre and already got experience of doing pre-entry, I might say, well, my staff could teach that for you. But then you would say, well, is that a subcontract? Is it a service level agreement? We'd have to make sure that that complies with the rules relating to subcontracting, and every individual one would have to be considered. Providing consultancy and advice and expertise advice is okay. That would just simply be on a commercial basis. So I haven't got any experience of doing X. Can you give me that help to set this up? Now, that would not be necessary. That's a provision of service, and it's not a subcontract in that way. For example, if you wrote the pre-entry courses and provided all the materials, then that would not be a problem, because that's what a publisher does, isn't it? So I think, Aniela, you're right. I think I can see a role for the expertise in these centres that have got a lot of experience, particularly at pre-entry level, in being consultants and advisors. It's when they start to want to use your staff, to do the delivery, because they haven't got any experienced staff to do it, that we get into the realms of, is this actually a subcontract? And therefore, would you have to go through the process of making sure that you were, well, the register doesn't exist if it's less than 100,000. Now, some of your centres, I believe, would be okay as subcontractors because they don't intend to deliver any more than £100,000 worth of service to the prime. But how they get in contact with that prime is about basically saying, well, find out you've got your unique offer that you can make as a centre. I would always suggest work with your local authorities or someone like WEA if you're not already working with them, or well, we used to work with, you can't do it now with Remploy because Remploy have got a slightly different function, although they're involved in the advising and consulting, and just do it at local level. The other reason why I think it's got to be done at local level is a real concern about what we call distance support. And I know that the digital skills will lend itself to online, but actually not at pre-entry level. I think most of those learners would want to do it face-to-face. So therefore, go and approach a local authority or a local college and say, look, we can work, we've got this experience. Can we work in some way that isn't a subcontract, but some kind of service level agreement that we can provide the following things? Of course, if you're already using volunteers, then volunteers can work for a range of providers at the same time. But I think you need to have a strong offer, Aniela. In other words, there's an expertise or a niche. And one of those could be that the fact is that, we already have a position with a community that, you don't currently reach. And therefore, that's an advantage in working with us. But it's still got to be done in a way where, you comply with all the regulations. So it's not just it's not going to be one approach will work for everyone. With some people, it will certainly mean that you'd have to go into a formal agreement, and others, it would just be a service level agreement that says that you've provided us with expert advice and guidance to the value of 300 hours or 20 hours or 30 hours of support. But you would, as soon as you start to deliver it, actually deliver it, even if it's a part of it, it starts to move into the realms of subcontracting. But I think the point I made about A/B having alternative entry opportunities for new providers, I think is a valid point. Now, if the register is going to be decommissioned from the 31st of July, what are we going to have from the 1st of August? And as you said, by the time we get to next 2022, what's going to be the demand for the Essential Digital Skills Qual? I think it's going to be massive. So would there be more opportunities for different ways of working? I think Aniela, just watch this spot. Watch this and see what happens.
Thank you, Beej. Thanks. Does anybody else have any further questions for Beej? If not, don't worry if they kind of come after the session. I know funding's always an issue, isn't it? That we will always be talking about. But if does anybody have any final questions for Beej? No.
Well, thanks for that. Then thanks everyone. Thanks for joining me, and thanks very much for the interaction. I appreciate that. So thanks, Aniela. Thanks, Laura.
Thanks, Beej. And like I say, I think perhaps we just need to have some optimism that perhaps something will be around the corner and there will be different opportunities. And like Beej said, I think the Essential Digital Skills Quals will be a priority in a lot of areas going forward. So let's keep the conversation going and see how things progress.
And Aniela, if I could just add one thing. Yeah. Those of you particularly who are in devolved areas, there is a lot more flexibility and movement and variability about. Now, I know initially some of you might have a very bitter experience of what happened when the first devolved authorities went through the procurement, because basically there was an expression used as the long tail. I don't know if you ever heard that, the long tail of small providers, and several hundred providers disappeared. They just simply didn't get any more funding. I think that was a mistake, because I think it preempted something which, it was maybe wait a while. The key thing is some of those were quality providers. And I think now that we've got those gaps, guess what? They're all reopening procurement opportunities, because they're saying, well, no one's doing this. No one's doing this in, I'll make an example. No one's doing any of the essential digital skills in Blackburn and Darwin. Why not? That's just an example. I don't know if that's the case. And all of a sudden you might find that Greater Manchester is having to go out, or Blackburn and Darwin's going out and saying, we're going to have a procurement. Who wants to come in and do the essential digital skills? The only condition I would put on anyone listening in today is don't have any concerns about the quality of what you do. If you've got concerns about the quality, for example, if you've found it difficult to get accreditation from an awarding body, you're not in the right place. I think you've got to make sure that your quality is the key thing. So that's the only condition I would put.
Thank you very much for that, Beej, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Obviously, we've got some contact information for Beej on there, and we also have in our chat panel there our link to the other sessions that we have in this series about digital skills. But thank you for joining us, and I'll just leave the last few minutes for any other questions.